Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has rebuffed repeated offers by President Trump to conduct airstrikes on cartels in Mexico to stop drugs from coming across the border. She said, quote, "It's not going to happen." Meanwhile, Mexican mayors and other local officials are frequent cartel targets as Americans are being killed through the flow of fentanyl. Why won't Sheinbaum accept the help? Joining us now is Ammon Blair, a senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He specializes in border security and immigration policy with over 2 decades of experience as a U.S. Border Patrol agent and U.S. Army officer. Ammon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for having me.
Now, Sheinbaum has refused military help from the U.S. partly because of past internal failures where they deployed troops to combat cartel power, but the result was increased violence. Now, her strategy of improving intelligence gathering and investigatory powers has resulted in the arrest of some of the major cartel leaders, but some experts are saying it hasn't cut the flow of drugs into the U.S. So why isn't her strategy working?
Well, this is a great question. That is because the Mexican cartels are one and the same with the Mexican government at the subnational level all the way to the federal level. Look, we are not dealing with the 1980s or 1990s Colombia, where we're going after with the Colombian government against the Medellin or the Cali cartel. We are now dealing with a situation much like Afghanistan, where the insurgency or the terrorist organizations are one and the same with the federal government.
Now, although Sheinbaum won't allow U.S. forces to go into Mexico, she is willing to share intelligence, and she's turned over some of the arrested cartel members to the U.S. for prosecution. Now, you said they are one and the same, but can this strategy actually work long term to end the cartel problem?
No, ma'am. They are getting, we are receiving the bottom of the barrel. The Mexican government, of course, they're not going to hand over their officials. When you look, there was a map that was released under the AMLO administration in 2019 that showed that the Mexican cartels at that time controlled 57% of the populated areas of Mexico, with an additional 23% that was contested against the Mexican military. So that left around 19 to 20% of the government controlled by the Mexican government. The rest was completely controlled by the cartels. If you look at the violence from the election cycle in 2024, you'll notice that over 80% of the violence happened at the subnational level. So if you were a mayor or a candidate to be a mayor, that is the most dangerous job right now in Mexico.
Now, one of the other things that she's actually saying is her concern is that she wants to maintain her country's sovereignty. So would carrying out these strikes on cartels, pushing drugs at the border mean a loss of sovereignty to Mexico?
Ma'am, unfortunately, the president herself, Mexico is a state sponsor of terrorism. If you look at how many countries the Mexican cartels operate in, not just the U.S., but they operate in 65 countries. And if they are tied to the Mexican government, that means Mexico, as well as their proxy fighters, the Mexican cartels, have made incursions into 65 other countries and broken their sovereignty. So we are at a point where we need to look at this as in a diplomatic stance where, look, President Sheinbaum, the Mexican government, you have already encroached into other countries. Either you need to face up the fact that your own officials are part of the cartel themselves, or receive the negative consequences of being a state sponsor of terrorism.
Now, I looked at a poll back in October of this year that said that the president in Mexico had a 70% favorability rate. But your foundation conducted a poll in January that said 78% of Mexican voters believe the security risk posed by cartels are unacceptable. Yet the voters were split on whether the U.S. should intervene. So why are Mexican citizens divided on this issue?
Because they really don't believe that anything's going to happen. Look, Mexico has been ravaged by the Mexican cartels for such a long time. When Mexico was under the one-party rule by the PRI until like the late 80s, early 90s, the federal government kind of had a control over them. But once they started losing that one-party rule, the cartels became an insurgency, and that was already in the 90s. So fast forward to today, it's been decades where the people of Mexico have been under the rule either by a tyrannical government or by foreign terrorist organizations. And so they don't see that their everyday life is going to be impacted at all, even if the U.S. government goes in. They can look at our track history with Afghanistan. Look what happened there. We were there for decades in Afghanistan, only to pull out and lose all that we lost, all that we gained, all the soldiers that died for what? And so they see our track record in terms of countering an insurgency or terrorist organizations, and they look, oh, maybe it's just better if we just continue to operate as the status quo.
Well, back in the U.S., Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said the U.S. wouldn't unilaterally send troops into Mexico. So do you think he's willing to carry out strikes without the approval from the Mexican president, with Americans dying from fentanyl?
Not at this point. I think that if they use a foreign diplomacy along with getting other international organizations as well as foreign countries to try to force Mexico to do the right thing. Look, if the United States can get all the remaining 60 plus countries together to force Mexico to actually look into this threat problem, I think that would be a better situation. They're going to continue to conduct the operations in the Caribbean, but for the most part, those are Tren de Aragua or Cartel de Suns. They're not the Mexican cartels. And so I think the most strategic thing that they can do now is, just like what Pete Hegseth said, is probably not bomb or send troops inside, but utilize our intelligence assets and utilize foreign diplomatic pressure.
Well, as you said, if the Mexican government is in with the cartel, it's going to be very difficult for the U.S. and these other countries to help them. Ammon Blair, Senior Fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.